I'm Micheal Marrow, Air Warfare Reporter for Breaking Defense, and I'm here with Representative Rob Wittman, who is the chairman of the House Armed Services Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee. Representative Wittman, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Michael. Great to be with you.
So we're going to hit a few topics today. And first, I want to talk to you about collaborative combat aircraft.
Yes.
This has been a big topic for the Air Force, also the Navy, to close a gap with China to ensure that the services have an affordable mass.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you specifically about the timeline for getting those into production.
Yes.
Secretary Kendall has said that he wants to see production start by the end of the FIDUP, the Future Defense Plan, roughly FY28 timeframe maybe. But specifically, something else I want to ask about is I was just in Dubai at the International Air Chiefs Conference,
Yes.
and a representative from the Indian Air Force said that he viewed that capability being kind of 10 to 20 years away, which seemed to be somewhat of a reality check for the U.S. Air Force. And I just want to get your take on that. You know, where does the Air Force stand, you know, in being ready for production of this capability, also relative to our allies?
Well, I think based on the scope and breadth of the threat, I think we have to move things even further to the left. I think we can do that. I think there are a number of companies out there now that are in production of certain variations of the aircraft, certain capabilities. I think that we have to move as quickly as we can. I think that capability is a game changer, especially when you combine that with our current fighter aircraft. That really enables our manned fighter aircraft to do a tremendous amount, whether it's sensing, whether it's shooting, whether it's jamming. That's an incredible force multiplier for us. If it was just in the concept stage, I'd say, 28 to 30, somewhere around there. But there are platforms right now that we could go to production on. Now, large-scale, full-scale production, probably not yet, but I don't think you need a tremendously large number of these aircraft to really get on the front end of that learning curve. And I think starting the learning curve now to understand what these aircraft can and cannot do, how do you combine them operationally with our manned fighter aircraft, how do you operate them too with crews, both in the aircraft, in the air, and on the ground? How does autonomy play in that? You know, we have the Autonomous Systems Adoption and Policy Act, which is going to create a single function in the Pentagon for autonomy. I think now is the time to do that. I think we have a lot of capability. You know, I want to make sure that we are understanding this so that we can run when we get to that particular point. I think do smaller scale production to get on that steep learning curve. And then we can actually move production when we start to scale a little bit to the left. I think we have to have that in the realm so that as China looks at this, they go, wow, that's a capability that really is going to play in any sort of conflict scenario in the Indo-Pacific.
Right. So one of the functions of CCA could be, electronic warfare.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you about the U.S. services competency in, the Spectrum fight.
Yes.
Earlier this year, Colonel Koslov, who's the head of the Air Force's Spectrum Warfare Wing, said
Yes.
that the U.S. is behind China
Yes.
In this respect. So what's your take on that?
Well, they are. Listen, the Army's behind. The Army needs to look at where they are in Spectrum, how they use Spectrum, how they make sure that they have a tactical advantage with Spectrum. The Air Force has set up the Spectrum Warfare Wing, which they need to look at how do you use Spectrum within that realm. Spectrum is incredibly important as it relates to sensing, getting information back that's target capable data. You have to be able to do that through Spectrum. Jamming is also about how to use Spectrum. We have to look at how our adversaries are using Spectrum. We are a step behind in that. I think, though, there are lots of capabilities there. I'm very confident that we can catch up at the speed of relevance in that realm because we do have experience in other areas that are directly translatable to how you would effectively use Spectrum in that realm. I think leadership has looked at it and said they're going to elevate these operations to that level. I think that we have the capability to do that.
Right, and on the Army's been weighing a lot of changes to its force structure, especially as it tries to pivot for a fight in the Indo-Pacific.
Yes.
So, what do you have any concerns about the Army's near-term plans for its force structure, and long-term as well? What do you want to see from the Army?
Well, I want to see them have a plan that looks at how do they operate, not just in the conventional sense in a European theater, but how do you operate at the tyranny of distance in the Indo-Pacific?
Right.
I think General Flynn is struggling to make sure he puts all the pieces together. And he said, listen, I need long-range precision fires, which he does. So the Army needs to get long-range precision fires done as quickly as possible. To their credit, I think they're putting technology in place. Assistant Secretary Doug Bush, I think he's doing a lot to be able to do that, taking existing platforms, modify them so you can have long-range precision fires in the Indo-Pacific. The Army needs to get lighter and faster. To their credit, they've said, hey, listen, if we're going to do a modernization of Abrams, we want to look at how do we change that? How do we make it to where it's more likely to be used as an autonomous platform? How do we make it lighter? How do we do things in the new realm where distance is going to be at issue? How do we operate more effectively? How do we make sure we put enablers in for our boots on the ground? How do we look at smaller platforms, things that can work in conjunction with our infantry units to enable them? There's a lot of unmanned platforms out there that can work in several ways. They can be essentially assist platforms for infantry units. They can be for deployed units to do sensing.
Right.
There are a lot of different ways that they can do that. They have to incorporate that into their operational planning. You know, for years they've operated under the brigade combat team. So you look at that combined armor, combined arms, combine all the different aspects of that. Now as they've changed operating concepts to the multi-domain task force, they're looking at using assets in all the different realms. The question is how do they most effectively integrate a modernized Army into that operating concept? I think that really pushes them to think creatively and to think in ways that they can operate effectively over the space of distance. And the most important aspect of that doesn't get mentioned is the Army has to have a robust logistics element, which is not there now. How do they get to the fight? We have 46 ships that are on average 42 years old. They may have the best combat structure around in a multi-domain task force, but they better be deployed forward because they're going to have a hard time getting there. So logistics has to be part of that too. I would argue logistics is one of the most important parts of that and what the forces need to think about today. Sometimes it becomes an afterthought, but if you look at the challenge that Transcom has and the service branches have, I go back to what General Omar Bradley said in World War II, who was one of the main planners for things like D-Day and others. He said that tactics are for amateurs, logistics are for professionals.
Right.
And that's going to be a challenge for the Army. So you can do all the multi-domain task force operational elements well, but if you can't get there and if you can't sustain yourself once you get there, then all the other stuff goes for naught.
Right. So one last topic is we've heard a lot of discussion today at the forum about two key pieces of legislation that need to move through Congress. One is the National Defense Authorization Act, which your committee is obviously very closely involved in crafting. And the other is the supplemental package that the Biden administration has proposed, where there are a few sticking points in Congress. Some Republican members recently have been more reluctant to pass aid for Ukraine, and some Democratic members have now voiced concerns about aid for Israel and maybe placing conditions on that. So I was hoping you could discuss a path forward for both of those kind of key pieces of legislation.
Sure. Well, let's start with the supplemental. There are elements of the supplemental that have to pass. Dollars for the submarine industrial base, dollars to make sure we're doing modernization in other areas, especially in the munitions realm. We do have to make sure we address the issue with Ukraine. Remember, the funding for Ukraine that's recommended, about 90% of that is actually for restocking weapons magazines. So those dollars will actually be spent here in the United States.
Right.
I think you have to look at how do we relegate that to lethal aid to Ukraine. The humanitarian side, I think, needs to be done separately. The efforts with Israel, I think, will be part of this. The question is how will this be separated? I don't think that you're going to see the proposal from the White House come over as a single piece of legislation. I think it'll probably be broken into parts. The question is, well, what will be in both of those parts? I do think that it'll get done. I think it has to get done with the criticality of these issues that we face around the world, and we can't wait months on end to get it done. So I hope it gets done, if not by the end of the year, at the latest by early next year. As far as NDAA, I think we're very close to finishing the conference report, get everybody to hopefully sign off on it. At that particular point, I think it'll begin in the Senate. The Senate will do its process. Of course, they have the ability through their process to kind of extend things if certain senators want to, which I understand some may, to make sure certain elements of this are debated. So it probably, if the clock is played out on this, probably gets to the Senate, out of the Senate in the week after next, and then gets over to the House probably by the end of that week. So I would say within the next 2-week window, we most likely have a Defense Authorization Act hopefully pass through both the House and Senate.
Got it. Well, that's all the time we have. Once again, I'm Micheal Marrow, Air Warfare Reporter for Breaking Defense, here with Chairman Rob Wittman, who heads the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee for the House Armed Services Committee. Thank you so much for joining us, and take care.